Welcome back to the world of Fallout. Welcome back to the Wasteland, everybody, where today we're going to be talking about the traits of Fallout. Now, we're not necessarily just going to be talking about the traits of Fallout New Vegas. I did a whole video talking about that at one point and kind of ranking them, going over which ones were the best ones to take, which ones were kind of situational, which ones weren't really that great, and why you may want to take one or the other. You could always get two traits in that game, but the traits actually go back to the older Fallout games, to Fallout 1, 2, and Tactics. They don't appear in Fallout 3, 4, or 76, but I think it would be kind of cool to get traits back into Fallout 5 whenever we get Fallout 5. And it's mostly just the aspect of traits, because I really like the idea of something that is pretty much equivalent to a perk, but it has some sort of downside. I really like that mechanic in most games because you're always trading off something so you can build your character to something more specific. That's kind of the reason why I don't really like Fallout 4's progression system, because eventually by the end game of Fallout 4, basically every build is the same build, with maybe some variation. It's going to be, I'm going to build up my main weapon, I'm going to build up whatever my armor is, I'm going to build whatever my upgrades are for that weapon, and then I'm just going to pick all the perks that are quality of life things, or just give me passive damage buffs. Same thing happened in Starfield as well, where basically none of the starting classes really mattered that much, besides their starting skills, and maybe some dialogue in the case of Starfield, but that was about it. Everything else didn't really matter. So traits having a pro and a con, I really enjoy. So let's go over the traits that have appeared in the Fallout games. And some of these are going to be a little bit surprising to people that may not have played the older games of Fallout, but have played the more recent ones, at least from 3 onward, because some of these later became perks. So let's just start out with our very first one, which is definitely a perk in the later games. This is Bloody Mess. Bloody Mess in the older games was actually a trait that you could pick at the very start of the game. Bloody Mess's benefits in the old part of the game still gave you more violent animations like they did in the later games in Fallout 3 onward, as well as this was the only trait in the game that actually didn't have a downside. This is very similar to like how Wild Wasteland works in Fallout New Vegas, where it's a trait that makes it so you can have some sort of bonus, in this case more violent death animations, but you don't really get any sort of negative from it because you're just kind of changing the way the game plays out. More violent animations in the older games doesn't really matter in terms of really anything besides just seeing the gore on screen, which is fine, but it's not like how Bloody Mess works in Fallout 3 onward, where it can just cause the enemy to explode, which can be a bonus because then you could potentially go and loot the body, as well as Bloody Mess would become a perk that would just be a pretty much nice perk to have on really any of the games, where you just got 5% more damage towards everything. Not a massive buff. It never had any sort of limit to it. It didn't have any sort of requirements to it other than being like, I think it was level 6 in Fallout 3 in New Vegas. It was always a decent perk. As a trait, it was okay in the older games, but nothing way crazy. This wouldn't show up again in something like Fallout New Vegas. I think this one is better left as a perk rather than left as a trait, because it doesn't really add too much. It actually takes away stuff if you're a YouTuber like me, where you make videos on this, and Bloody Mess can sometimes get your video demonetized or age restricted. Well, mostly demonetized. I don't think I've ever had one age restricted from Bloody Mess, but that is kind of a negative for us, so you probably won't want to have that. I don't know if that's the same in the older games. I haven't streamed any of the older games, but maybe I will in the future. Bloody Mess is an okay one, but I think it stays better as a perk. Our next one is called Bruiser. This one's benefit in the old games made it so you get +2 strength, which is pretty good. +2 to any special stat is pretty nice, but the penalty from this is -2 action points. And -2 action points in the later games would be nothing. Like if you're on Fallout 3, 4, New Vegas, whatever, +2 strength in those games, you would basically be taking this one every single run, because that's just such a big bonus, and -2 action points is not that big of a deal. In the older games, though, this was actually a pretty big deal. Action points worked differently than they do in Fallout 3, 4, and New Vegas, where the only benefit to having them, besides 4 also being for stamina consumption, would be that you maybe don't hit as many shots in VATS, but I mean, only 2 action points loss isn't that big of a deal. In the older games, though, your action points dictated everything that you could do in combat. So this was how far you could move. Could you change your stances in combat? Could you enter your bag and use items? Could you reload your gun? Could you make a shot? Could you make an aim shot? And -2 action points is a heavy loss in the old games, so it was not that great of a trait in the older games. If this did come back, it would have to be reworked as a trait in Fallout 5, because +2 strength for -2 action points, assuming that they're going with the same way action points work in Fallout 4, yeah, that would be like a must pick every single game. Then we have our 2 chem perks in the older Fallout games, and pretty much all of these perks also span each of the games. They may change slightly, but not very much. So Fallout 1, 2, and Tactics all basically had the same perks with minor adjustments to them. The chem perks were chem reliant and chem resistant. So chem reliant made it so that you recover twice as fast from chem addictions, because in the older games you couldn't really go to a doctor, although I think you could in Fallout 2. And maybe in Tactics as well, you could talk to the Brotherhood doctors there to get your addiction cured if you had it. Otherwise, you just have to wait out the addiction, so that might take a very long time depending on how many chems you took and when you took them. And the downsides were pretty significant from the chems in those games if you did get an addiction. The penalty to this, though, is that you were twice as likely to become addicted. So something like this wasn't really all that good. And if this was going to be implemented in Fallout 5, it would have to be changed quite a bit as well. Because recovery rates on addiction, I guess it could just be that you can recover from addictions without talking to a doctor. But with how doctors kind of work from Fallout 3 onward, it's not that big of a deal to just rush right to one and have them fix you. So this one would be basically a never pick trait. Being twice as likely to be addicted to chems wouldn't be good in any of the games. So yeah, you'd probably just skip this trait. I could see it working as like a perk or maybe a trait later on, but it would need to be reworked a little bit. Chem resistant, on the other hand, made it so you were half as likely to become addicted to chems, but chems lasted half as long. This one I think would be fine to keep as a trait. It did become a perk later on, where it was just you get basically the bonus, you have half the addiction rate, and in games like Fallout 3, 4, and New Vegas, this is pretty strong, particularly in 4, where you could just not become addicted. So that was really, really good, especially when they started introducing different chems like Turbo in Fallout New Vegas and the way that Jet works in Fallout 4 that can just slow down time. Being able to pop those whenever you'd like, kill things at a much more efficient rate, and not have to worry about addictions is really good. So if this did come back as a trait, it would probably be lumped in with chem reliant in some way, because I think chem resist as a perk is perfectly fine. Then we had fast metabolism. This one later became a perk as well. Fast metabolism in the older games gave you +2 healing rate, so you could heal naturally over time, which was useful in those older games, depending on where you went, and especially if you were wandering around the map, you could heal up a little bit quicker, but it made it so your poison resist and radiation resist is 0. This can be buffed with like armors and with different chems that would buff those things up. In the later games, I honestly don't know if this would really matter that much. Fast metabolism would be changed entirely in the later games, where it would just affect stim packs and you just get better healing from them. And stim packs, as well as other medical supplies, did exist in the older games as well. So having a healing rate bonus is kind of nice for this, that you could passively regenerate HP, but lowering your radiation and poison resist could be a big deal. It depends, because poison has never really been that big of a deal in any of the Fallout games besides maybe New Vegas, thanks to things like the Cazadors. Rad resistance also really hasn't been that big of a deal in any of the Fallout games either, funny enough, because most areas that have really high radiation are either you're given a lot of supplies to go into those areas, or you're specifically not supposed to go into those areas because that's just kind of like a dead zone. You're supposed to find a way around them. So in those regards, then having 0 radiation resist wouldn't really matter all that much, but it could be potentially annoying in an early game where you might be getting a decent amount of radiation, especially in like Fallout 4 where it decreases your maximum HP, and having slightly better healing may not matter all that much. So I think this one could come back, but you'd probably want to rename it since fast metabolism has became a perk now, at least in 3 and New Vegas, so maybe this one could come back. Then we've got Fast Shot. Fast Shot did appear in Fallout New Vegas. I actually talked about it not too long ago. It gives you an increased rate of fire and a reduced action point cost, but it does make your gun a little bit less accurate. Not a huge deal in that game, and I think it's one of the better perks. In the older games, it's also probably one of the better perks, because this one makes it so all weapons, or all ranged weapons, depending on which version of Fallout that we're talking about, cost 1 less action points to use to attack with, but they can't be used for aim shots. Now, in the older games, you could either do regular shots at enemies, which costed less, and would just go for center of mass, which was perfectly fine, especially in the early game. That was usually the best way to do it, as well as certain weapons couldn't make aim shots if they were like full auto weapons. If they fired in burst rounds, then they had to be just center of mass shots. If you had a semi-automatic weapon though, or a single shot weapon, whatever it might be, you could toggle on a aimed shot, and that would allow you to attack limbs specifically. Think of it similar to how VATS works now in Fallout 3 onwards, where you could pick to target somebody's head. In the older games, you could pick somebody's eyes to target. There was actually a couple different places that you could attack like that. And if you hit those shots, then you generally did more damage, especially if you shot somebody in the eyes with like a Gauss rifle or something. As you would kind of imagine, that would do a lot of damage to somebody. So sometimes the shots actually did matter. In later games like Fallout Tactics, this was still not that big of a deal because most weapons, or at least most really good weapons, were like burst fire, and you just wanted to kind of spray them at enemies. And even if that wasn't technically the highest amount of damage, in Tactics you also had a whole squad of people, so not everybody needs to have this. But if you wanted to take it on your main character, it could actually be pretty good. In the older games, it was kind of situational, and I think that this one would be perfectly fine to add into the later games, like if we put it in Fallout 5. The next trait is Finesse, which later became a perk too, and it changed a little bit. So in the older games, this just gave you 10% crit chance, so it was twice as good as it is later on into Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. But the downside was that you lost 30% overall damage with everything. So this one really depended on how you like to play. In the early game, generally this one is going to be a hindrance to you in the older games, because you're probably not going to be hitting crits as often. If you build a character specifically made for crits, then this one could be potentially good, where you could potentially do a lot of damage to enemies. If this was added into the later games of Fallout, I could see this one being potentially a tempting option if you already knew ahead of time what your weapons and build was going to be. If you were going to use a weapon with a really high crit chance, or maybe a guaranteed crit chance, then this one probably wouldn't really be all that good, because you could probably achieve that without it. It might make certain other weapons better, though, especially if there was any weird weapons like how the shotguns work in Fallout 3, then this one would be insane, because lowering their damage really wouldn't matter, and just being able to guarantee crits would be crazy on them. So this one I could see returning as a potential trait, but it would probably have to be changed around a little bit. Next is probably one of the craziest traits that was in the older games, and would probably also be crazy in the later games. So the next one is Gifted. This one was +1 to all special stats at the very start of the game, but minus 10% to all of your skills. In the older games, your skills were based on percentage, so you didn't go from like 0 to 100, you could go from like 0 to 300%. So minus 10% could be actually a decent amount, although probably not so much at the start. On top of that, it also had the other downside of minus 5 points every time that you leveled up to put into your skills. And that could be a pretty big deal. If you got like 20 points per level, and you're losing out on 5 of them every level, it will make it so that you can't upgrade absolutely everything in the old games unless you just want to get really high leveled, which isn't really practical. On the other hand, though, if you're just going for a specific build, then this one would still be fine. And in the later games, in like Fallout 3 and New Vegas, if this one was added, you could subvert this quite a few ways, because this one would still be absolutely insane. And even if you got minus 10 to all of your stats, that wouldn't really matter, because you can overshoot your stats by so much in those games. So it would make certain perks even more of a tempting option, like Comprehension or Educated. I kind of want to see it in there just to see how crazy it would be. Then we had Good Natured. Good Natured basically stayed the same way that it did all the way up through Fallout New Vegas, where this one gave you more skills towards whatever passive bonuses that you had, or passive skills. So in the older games, this was like Speech, Barter, First Aid, and Doctor. The older games had like First Aid and Doctor, which were 2 separate skills, but then it gave you minus 10 to all of your other combat stats. So in the older games, this would be big guns, small guns, energy weapons, throwing, melee weapons, and unarmed. Not counting traps, though, because traps were kind of weapons, but not always. The old games actually had a lot of different ways to attack, even though they might not have very many weapons to actually use there. So if you're going with a particular build, then this one was good. And if you're only building up one of those skills, or 2 of those skills, it doesn't really matter if you're losing out on the others, because if you're going for only a melee build, you're only actually losing 10% to melee, or 5 points to melee in the case of New Vegas, which isn't that big of a deal. You can build that back up really quick. And getting more bonuses to your passive skills are potentially better, especially when completing quests and stuff. So I think Good Natured could absolutely fit into Fallout 5. It would be a perfectly fine trait to have. It's pretty much always been a perfectly fine trait in any of the games. If you want to take it, cool. If you don't want to take it, also cool. Then we had Heavy Handed. This one also appeared in Fallout New Vegas. This one gave you +4 to your melee damage in the old games. So the way damage worked in the old games was that you had a weapon, then you also had whatever skills dictated that, and you potentially also had special stats that dictated it, and the weapon might have a damage of like 8 to 20, so it could hit anywhere in between there. 20 if it high rolled, 8 if it low rolled. giving it +4, especially on the low end of weapons, is actually really good, and that's a pretty significant bonus to melee. The downside to this in the older games is that you got -30% crit damage, which is kind of rough for the old games, because hitting crits was really good in the old games, and funny enough, there was actually Slayer in the old games, which just guaranteed crits, so you could basically, well, I mean, you'd still do reduced damage, but you'd still be doing more damage if you got up to that level to actually get Slayer. So in that regard, it was actually a really good combination if you wanted to do that, at least for a late game. Early game, it was still pretty decent too, because you might just want the base damage, you don't really care about crits, and melee was pretty solid in all of the early games. In the later games, in like Fallout New Vegas, this one still wasn't particularly bad, it's just not as good as some of the other options that you had for a melee build. I think this one would be perfectly fine to add, especially if you just took the version from New Vegas and threw it into like Fallout 5. I think that would be perfectly fine. Then we have a really interesting one that I think could be super fun to appear in a later Fallout game, which is Jinxed. So Jinxed made it so that there was more likely to have critical failures on the enemy part, but you also suffered from more critical failures as well. It generally wasn't good on like a first playthrough. It was usually more for like, you know, a second or third playthrough when you kind of get the idea of how to play the game. You don't necessarily want this to kind of ruin your game on the first time because maybe you didn't build way great and you're getting beat up, and then having your guns fail you is not a good thing. This would also be cool if it was in the later games as well. It didn't appear in New Vegas, but if you put it in Fallout 5, I would absolutely love to see this, because I imagine it could add to a whole bunch of hilarious moments of just weird stuff happening. Maybe your gun malfunctions, maybe your gun explodes, maybe something great happens, maybe something just random happens. I would really like to see that in the game too. I think that would be really, really fun. Then we had Kamikaze, which this one did actually get changed between the games. This one got changed more significantly than some of the others. So Kamikaze was also in Fallout New Vegas, and I think this one would be a pretty cool one to actually put into the later games. Kamikaze in the early games gave you +5 to your sequence. This was basically movement and interactions and stuff like that, or kind of like chance to go first. So it was good in those games. In Fallout Tactics, this just gave you like 25% more damage with everything, which is pretty great. And then in New Vegas, this one just gave you more action points. So this is pretty cool. They all gave you good things in each of these games. The downsides were pretty much the same though, where you would just take more damage. Where in the older games, this would completely disrupt your armor rating. So armor class was basically just could you dodge or could you just tank through damage to where you just wouldn't get hit. This isn't the same as if you did get hit and it took damage, but just kind of rolling on that. So it made it so you were more likely to get hit, more likely to take damage, but you did more damage in return, generally speaking. And that's kind of good. I do like a perk like this where it's more of a trade-off, and I think that this one would fit perfectly fine into like Fallout 5 as well. Then we've got Night Person. Night Person would later become a perk in Fallout 3 onwards. This one was never really that great. Even in the later games as a perk, it was never really that great. I don't know of anybody that really took this one on any of the games, because getting a temporary +1 to 2 skills doesn't usually matter all that much. Even as a perk, it doesn't really matter because it's just not that great of a perk. You could just get pluses permanently to those stats if you would like, with something like Intense Training. Then we got One-Hander, which funny enough actually kind of changed between 1, 2, and Tactics. So One-Hander just made it so that you were more likely to hit with one-handed weapons and you were less likely to hit with two-handed weapons. This was a 20% bonus for one-handed guns and a -40% accuracy for two-handed guns. Generally, this one wasn't necessarily a bad one to have in the older games. In Tactics, it's changed slightly to where you have a little bit different of a bonus. But generally speaking, this one wasn't really that great because most of the time you wanted to have a two-handed weapon. Rifles and shotguns and big guns generally were better than the pistol versions of the weapons. That's not to say that they were terrible, and if you wanted to do this, then you absolutely could, especially with certain weapons it was pretty strong, like the Gauss pistols. That was good, but it does limit your overall arsenal, and it makes it a little bit awkward throughout different parts of the game, mostly towards like the mid-game, where you're not really getting like pistols, you're starting to get rifles and shotguns, and then you'll start getting, you know, kind of the end-game pistols later on, so you got a little bit of a lull going on. I would like to see this one appear in the later games, though. I think that would be really cool to give some sort of bonus. It would make a gunslinger build super fun, so I'd really enjoy that, and it would make it so you would have to play differently than what you normally do in, like, let's say Fallout 4, where so many of the strong weapons are like two-handed weapons. I think that would be a pretty cool little design rather than just making it into like your own challenge run. Skills in the older games gave you +10% to all of your skills, which is pretty good, But the downside for skilled in the older games was you lose out on a perk level. So instead of getting a perk every 3 levels like you did in the older games, this was a perk every 4 levels. Which is not really that good considering most of the time by the end of these older games, you probably weren't getting above like level 30. So this does significantly cut down the amount of total perks that you have at your disposal. If you've built your character specifically to where you don't really care about this, then this could still be a bonus. But it was pretty bad in the older games. I don't know of many people taking skilled. I don't think it was the worst trait. And I do kind of like this trade-off, because it does make it so you have to really be smart about what you're putting points into, but I don't think it was one of the strongest. In New Vegas, it was the strongest trait in the game, in my opinion, because it was just basically the same as this, although it was plus 5 to all of your skills, and then it was just minus 10% XP gain. That's not nearly as bad as you don't get a perk every other level, at least in New Vegas, and instead you would get a perk every 3 levels. If it had that downside, it would be pretty hard to actually recommend taking it. Unless your build could just work without it, in which case then it would be okay. And then our very last trait, at least in the older games, sort of, at least in Fallout 1 and 2, besides the other one from 2 that I need to talk about, is small frame. Small frame did appear in New Vegas as well, and small frame in the older games gave you plus 1 agility, which is good because that dictates how many action points you have, as well as it gave you minus 25 to your carry weight. Unless it was tactics, then it was minus 50 to your carry weight, but you do have 6 people on there, so in tactics, this one was actually pretty good. In the old games, this one could be good as well, plus 1 more to your special stats is nice. Losing out on weight can kind of suck in the older games. You don't get to carry around as much. In New Vegas, it made it so that your limbs weren't as durable as they otherwise would be. They break quicker, which could be really annoying if you're playing the hardcore difficulty, but I would still consider this a pretty good trait. And if you did break your limbs so much, you did get the tough guy challenge perk. So there were ways to get around this, and small frame I think would be another one that would fit really well into the world, and you really wouldn't have to change much. Whether you want to make it so that limbs break a little bit easier, or you want to make it so carry weight is lowered a little bit, that probably shouldn't matter too much, especially if they want to keep the carry weight system from like Fallout 4, where by the end game you can carry around like 600 pounds worth of stuff on you without any trouble, in which case minus 25 does not matter at all. Even in the early game, that probably wouldn't matter at all. Now, there was one other trait in Fallout 2, which this one was basically what the gender perks were later on in Fallout 3 and New Vegas, as well as 4 as well, where this one was just called sex appeal, and this one just made it so the opposite sex was more favorable towards you, but the same sex as you was less favorable towards you. This was mostly for like quest things, and you kind of see this in Black Widow and Lady Killer, and then later in Fallout New Vegas, where you've also got like Confirmed Bachelor and the French one that I have a problem saying. So I think this could fit perfectly fine into a later Fallout game. I don't really see that much of a downside. It could make a lot of quests more interesting, especially on repeat playthroughs if you add this or not. Fallout Tactics also had some more traits. These were racial traits, depending on which race that the character was, whether they were like a Deathclaw, a human, a ghoul, a robot, a dog, a super mutant, because you could have all those in Tactics as well. And these ones could be potentially interesting, maybe made to a human character, or at least a ghoul character. I think it would be cool if we could play as a ghoul character in one of the Fallout games. I know you kind of can in 76, but it's not quite the same thing. For this, Deathclaws could have 2 specific traits, where they could have Domesticated or Rabid. Domesticated made it so they got more intelligence. This was plus 2 permanent intelligence, but it did reduce their unarmed damage, and Deathclaws were pretty much just restricted to unarmed damage. Again, if you put this into the later games, I think this one would be too strong if people could take it, because plus 2 intelligence is a big bonus, and minus to your unarmed damage does not matter if you're not using unarmed. Maybe if you took it and you were locked into unarmed and you did unarmed damage less, similar to how the Deathclaws worked in Tactics, then that would be perfectly fine, but I don't know how well that would work. Rabid made it so that crippled limbs had less of an effect on you, as well as you got bonus action points after killing enemies, so it was kind of like Grim Reaper's Sprint. But this also made it so chems and stim packs had no effect on you if you wanted to use them. So you just had to heal naturally over time, which could be rough. I think in Tactics, though, you could still heal with like doctor's bags and med kits, but they had to be administered by somebody else to you. And if that was the case, I could see this actually working, and I could see this one being a really fun challenge run to put into a Fallout game, to where pretty much all of your healing doesn't work on you, or doesn't work as well on you, And you do kind of have to work around that, whether it's going like back to doctors to have them fix you up, or maybe you need a specific perks to kind of make it so you regenerate quicker. So this isn't that big of a deal. For other races, you had the Ghouls traits, which we had Fear the Reaper, which, I mean, I would really like that one in there. This one made it so you get -1 to your perk rate. So this one made it so Ghouls got perks as often as humans. Ghouls got perks every 4 levels. This would drop it back to 3. But whenever you would level up, this made it so the Ghoul that had it would go to critical health. So pretty much you were left at like 1 HP when you leveled up. This one could also be a fun one to have in a later game too, because that would be pretty terrifying, and it would be really inconvenient at certain points where you go to kill something, you kill it, and then all of a sudden you drop to critical HP and somebody threw a Molotov at you or a firebomb or a grenade at your feet or something like that, in which case it might actually kill you, and it might make for some pretty fun moments. So I would like to see Fear the Reaper come back. We also had Glowing One. This one increased your radiation resist, which is pretty cool, but it made it so you glow in the dark, which doesn't really matter all that much, except for enemy visibility at night on tactics. You could just fight in the day, and I don't think this mattered at all. And it also made it so you irradiate everybody around you. That could be kind of annoying, but I mean, if you're playing the newer games, this one wouldn't be that much of a downside. I don't think it'd be a huge upside, because again, radiation resist doesn't matter too much, but it would be one that you could throw in there if you'd like. And then the last Ghoul trait was Tech Wizard, which gave you an increase to your lockpicking, science, and repair, but it gave you -1 to your overall perception. This one may be okay. I mean, perception is generally one of the weaker special stats in the Fallout games, sort of, at least in 3 in New Vegas. Robots had 3 traits as well, where you had beta software. This just gave you tagged for free, so you tagged 4 skills, but it made it so you could have unexpected system glitches. This was kind of like Jinxed, where things could just go bad for you. So, yeah, I would be interested in this. I think that would be kind of a cool trait to have, where just more random stuff happens to you, but you do get a 4th tag skill. I don't think that would be too overpowered. You had EMP shielding. This just gave you EMP resist. This was more specific towards robots, since robots were really vulnerable to that in tactics. But you got -2 agility to it. That's a pretty big downside. In the later games, this one would be completely useless, and you'd never take it, unless it was to more than just EMP damage, because like, who cares about pulse grenades hitting you in any of the games? Even if you're wearing power armor and it does extra damage to you, you're still going to be fine. And then the last thing they had was targeting computer. This just gave them 15% more chance to hit, but it made it so it was 1 more action point cost for all of their attacks. Could be good in the old games, could be good in the later games, especially if it was just you get increased VATS hit chance, but it also increases the amount of action points you take. That's pretty much how trigger discipline works in New Vegas, and I think that one's perfectly fine as a trait if you want to take it, at least specifically for a VATS build. I guess robots had 4, I thought they only had 3. The other one they had was Tight Nuts, which I hope they add that one in, just for the name alone. I think it'd be good. This one gave you +5 more damage threshold to all damage types except for electrical, so if you got zapped, it didn't really help you, but it made it so robots were twice as difficult to repair. Repair was another skill that you had in tactics in the older games for actually fixing stuff. You could fail that, and if you failed some of these, they would actually damage your teammates more. So this could be interesting to have. It would be kind of weird to have a mechanic like that in the later games, but it might be something kind of fun, like your chems have potentially adverse effects. And then the last 2 traits that were in tactics were Ham-Fisted and Vat Skin. Both these go for super mutants. Ham-Fisted made it so it just tags unarmed, which honestly isn't all that crazy, but it gave you -10% to Doctor, First Aid, Repair, and Science. Basically, your passive skills got nerfed, but you got 15 more points, or in this case, you got a higher percentage because tagged worked a little bit different in the older games. You got a higher percentage to that one skill. So if you wanted to go with an unarmed super mutant build, this one is good. If you're going with any other build, it probably didn't matter. And then with Vat Skin, it was +10 more armor class, so more chance to dodge, and -1 perception to all nearby enemies, which made it so they were less likely to hit. But it also gave -1 to all nearby friendlies, including themselves, so you were also less likely to hit. I think this one would be fine. I think this one would be kind of a cool trait to see in the next game. I would like that. New Vegas had some other traits. A lot of these stayed kind of the same. We got some new ones, like Built to Destroy, that gave you more crit chance, but your weapon broke faster. I think that would be a cool one to actually throw into later games. Four Eyes, which gave you a temporary perception buff, but knocked off perception permanently. I think that one was terrible. You had Loose Cannon for throwing items. I think that one would be fine. And then Wild Wasteland, which was probably everybody's favorite, which just made it so you got random encounters and made it so the game had a lot more replayability whenever those random encounters do actually show up. So that was pretty cool. We later got some other traits from Old World Blues, like claustrophobic that made it so you get +1 special stats when you're outside, and then -1 when you're inside. Early bird that gave you +2 to your special stats early on into the day, but -1 later on. Hoarder, which lets you carry around more stuff. I would like to see Hoarder into later games too. I think that one would be really cool. We also got Hot-Blooded, which increases your damage once you're at low health, but it does decrease your perception and your agility when you're at low health. And then you also had Logan's Loophole, which capped your overall level at 30 rather than the total 50 that you could have in New Vegas, but it made it so chems lasted twice as long and you could never get addicted. You could also reroll this later, which made it a pretty strong perk if you weren't going for a full level run, or if you were just planning on going there and by the time you hit around level 30 or below in Old World Blues, you could just roll this off of there and go right back up to 50 and have a really easy early game. So a lot of these traits I think could remain in the games, and I think it would be really cool to have traits in the later Fallout games, again, whenever we get them. Which of these sounds the coolest to you, though? I would really like to hear that, and would you like to see traits in the later games? Also, would you like to see things like level caps in the later games, where like Fallout 4 made it so there's no level cap? Because I think I personally would. I would like to actually have dedicated builds, rather than one kind of dedicated build at the start, and then it just becomes everybody's build by the end. Tell me your thoughts. I would love to hear that. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye!